7, 8, 9, 10. This is Chad here, and you're listening to My Alien Life.
My Alien Life Podcast.
Three, two, one, zero, and liftoff.
From high in the Rocky Mountains and in the Great Northwest, I want to welcome all my friends from around the world, all my listeners from the 114 countries that listen to My Alien Life. A very heartfelt thank you to the country of Estonia, where the show is number 13 or something like that. At least that's what it says in the email I received 2 days ago. Thank you, podstatus.com. Of course, I want to thank Canada for listening to every week, and England and the entire United Kingdom. Australia, and not to be forgotten, New Zealand, Tasmania, and Germany. Thank you so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, or follow wherever you listen to podcasts. Please do that now because it makes it so much easier for others to find me. We have a great show tonight. Preston Dennett is here. Preston is one of the most thorough and well-known U.S. researchers in the world, with more than 24 books and countless articles. And with little doubt, there will be at least that many books from Preston Dennett in the future. In the news tonight, the Galactic Federation. According to retired Israeli officer and current professor Hayam Eshed, who served as the head of Israel's space program for nearly 30 years and is a 3-time recipient of the Israel Security Award, explained that Israel and U.S. have been dealing with aliens for years. The 87-year-old head of the Defense Ministry's Space Division gave further descriptions about exactly what sort of agreements have been made between the aliens and the U.S., which ostensibly have been made because they wish to research and understand the fabric of the universe. This cooperation includes a secret underground base on Mars where there are American and alien representatives. Eshed insists that President Trump is aware of them and that he was on the verge of disclosing their existence. However, the Galactic Federation reportedly stopped him from doing so, saying they wish to prevent mass hysteria since they felt humanity needed to evolve and reach a stage of where we will understand what space and spaceships really are. Of course, Eshed provided more information in his newest book, The Universe Beyond the Horizon, along with other details such as how aliens have prevented nuclear apocalypse and when we can jump and visit the Men in Black. This Galactic Federation has been in contact again with Israel and the U.S. for years, but are keeping themselves a secret to prevent hysteria until humanity is ready. And the question, he says, is, are we ready? Perhaps in the future, we may have to make the jump to hyperspace when we finally run out of room on Earth. Of course, we would probably need to think about a partial exit in 80 years when some scientists think that the Earth's population could reach critical mass and our planet could no longer support us. The UN publication World Population Prospects in 2017, they projected that the world population will reach 9.8 billion in 2050 and 11.2 billion in 2100. The human population is predicted to stabilize soon thereafter. A 2014 study published in Science asserts that population growth will continue into the next century. A 2012 UN report summarized 65 different estimated maximum sustainable population sizes. The most common estimate was 8 billion, a little larger than the current population, but the estimates ranged from as few as 2 billion to, in one study, a staggering 1 trillion. These estimates all depend on so many assumptions that they are difficult to say which is closest to the truth. So are they checking us out or sizing us up? Would we be suitable roommates with ET? My guest tonight is no stranger to anyone that knows anything about UFOs. Preston Dennett is easily one of the most recognizable names in ufology, and rightfully so, as he has published more than 24 books and over 100 articles. Preston Dennett, thank you so much for joining me, and welcome
Hey, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Great privilege to have you. Been waiting a long time to talk to you, and I've kind of been putting this one off because I just, I wanted to have enough material, and I know that you come prepared always, but I wanted a lot of questions, and hopefully we can talk about some real interesting things for some of my listeners, because you're one of the most requested people that I have on the show. So again, thank you so much for being here. How are you these days? Because I know that you probably aren't making as many appearances as you usually do at different events. Not that there's many this time of the year anyway, but are you writing a bunch of books?
Yeah, I found a way to keep busy. I used to work full time while doing this, so I'm not working full time right now. I do have some part-time work, but I'm able to devote a lot more time to this stuff, which I really enjoy doing. I was sad to have to cancel a few speaking events for sure. I snuck one in this year in February, but that was it. So been keeping busy, doing lots of research, putting out, writing another book, of course, due out in hopefully a couple of months, 3 or 4, we'll see.
Nice. So most of the people that listen are really familiar, but those who aren't, you and I have a lot in common as far as when we kind of really the year and time when we really started looking at UFOs seriously. And what year was that for you? And what was that event that made you become so interested and couldn't put down the subject of UFOs for so long?
Right. Yeah. A subject I was repulsed by, actually.
Yeah, me too, for a while. Yeah.
Really. I mean, I just didn't believe. It was pretty much that simple. I didn't want to hear about UFOs because I thought you were crazy, on drugs, insane. I don't know. I remember vividly how it all went down. 1986 was mid-November. There was a report on the news about a sighting over Alaska. A Japanese commercial airliner had seen this UFO. It was tracked on their radar, followed their plane for hours, many miles. They did a course change. It still followed them. None of this was in the news report. All they really said was, this pilot thinks he saw a UFO, and kind of laughed nervously and moved on. And which would be kind of my reaction normally. But I don't know. For some reason, I started asking people about it and got a real shock. I found out my brother had seen a UFO. My sister-in-law, a couple of friends. One had apparently had missing time. I brought it up at work. Same thing. A bunch of these people I'd worked with for years had seen UFOs. One lady's like, it followed us home from the library. She lost about 20 minutes of time and had no idea what she was talking about. By this point, I'm picking up books and trying to disprove this phenomena.
Do you remember the first book you picked up and what that was like looking at that?
I think I can remember the first cluster of books. There was about 5 of them or so. One of them was the book by Raymond Fowler, Betty Andreasson, her story. Also, Incident at Exeter by John Fuller, and the Betty and Barney Hill story as well, UFO incident, I believe, or Interrupted Journey. So those were the Travis Walton story. I found that one. And Roswell Incident, the first book out on that. Now there's 100? So it was just, there weren't a whole lot of books out back then. I found out there were some, but they were harder to find. Books like Donald Kehoe and Jim and Coral Lorenzen, they wrote a bunch of really excellent books. So it was a rough introduction for me. I did catch this wave in the late 1980s that I see a lot of investigators started around then. Barbara Lamb, Yvonne Smith, both kind of caught that wave too. I mean, partly due to Whitley Strieber and his, book Communion, which was so phenomenally successful and introduced so many people.
I had Whitley on the show and I had to tell him, that I just by coincidence had picked up his book and I was in college and I stopped at a yard sale. So I saw it and I remembered hearing about it. So I picked up that book and it was one of those books that took me over a year to read because to me, it was terrifying. I mean, that was the one that, I don't think I've ever read a UFO book that was more terrifying than that one. And, and to his credit, I think, that was due to the fact that he's a brilliant writer. He can write a story, and he can also put in vivid details and accurate details that he remembers to make it even more appealing. So when you read something, when you pick up a book, I mean, there's so many books about UFOs, and there's so many people that are writing UFO books, and they're publishing their own books. So there's lots of them. When you read one, what's something that you look for? What keeps you engaged in that book where you can't put it down and you're going to read it cover to cover?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. What are the top 100 books in ufology? Because there are a lot to pick from. And I would definitely put Communion up there at the top of the list, just because it was such an amazing story and so well written, with I think a very clear and honest, sincere narrative. And what's interesting about that book, I think, is Whitley had really made a name for himself as a horror writer, and found out that he knew fear pretty well because of his experiences. So it's really an excellent narrative of how one person dealt with this phenomena and overcame his fear of it, or at least to a certain extent. That's something I look for. Really, is a first-hand story. I love those best. Or researchers who are out there in the field doing the dirty work, if you know what I mean. I mean, picking up first-hand stories. That's kind of why I like Kehoe. He's pushing there on the edges of government. And Jim and Cora Lorenzen. I like Timothy Good's book, Above Top Secret. Very well-written and factual book. There's a lot of great books out there. Hynek's 2 books that he put out, 3, actually, I think it was. Loved them. Those were groundbreaking for sure.
And we keep seeing books, especially, I have a friend of mine, William Poulin, on the show once in a while, and he loves to study Roswell. And there's people out there who not only love to study it, but they love to read every book that comes out, whether they be good books or bad books. They're so interested in Roswell. What do you think? Why is that so pen-worthy? I mean, that's one of those situations where there's so many question marks, and there's so many different viewpoints that people have taken, including the military. Why do you think that stayed so popular for years? Because there's been some pretty amazing stories that have happened afterwards, in different parts of the U.S. So why is that one engaged so many people for so long?
Yeah, I certainly know about Roswell. I think we all do, and I think there's a number of reasons for it. I think if you were to chart the top 10 most famous, influential encounters in the world, Roswell would probably make that list, certainly in the U.S., for sure, be number 1. It's the grandfather of all UFO cases. It's got everything. It's got firsthand witnesses. It's got landing traces. It's got a crash retrieval. It's got alien bodies. It's got conspiracy. That's the case that really... the world could have been a very different place if that news release that was put out by Walter Haut was not retracted and said it was not a flying saucer, it was a balloon. It's really a shame. That case has hundreds of witnesses. We're still getting new information about it. Been a lot of researchers who've looked into it. I've got several of these books myself. I'm definitely studying this case. I know it's a bit of a dead horse, but I want to see it. Show us the darn craft. Kind of one of the reasons I'm in this field is because I want to see this stuff. And until that Roswell craft is in a museum, I'm not going to give up. There's been a lot of conflicting information on the case, I think, because there's disinformation in this field. This is a case that's probably been carefully manipulated to a certain extent. We know it kind of changed the policy of how UFO crashes were handled, and there was a very heavy lid clamped over them. They never made a mistake like Roswell ever again. So I think that's kind of some of the reasons why this is such an explosive case that won't go away. But there's many.
So have you come up with any really hard opinions about what really happened there? I mean, I know people who have taken the data or what they've read and interpreted that in a way where, you know, you couldn't tell them any different. But you said craft, so you think there's a craft.
I do. I bought the Air Force's book on it, Roswell Case Closed. It's a mogul balloon with dummies. Well, that was pretty easily debunked. Because we know that they weren't dropping dummies at the time of the Roswell UFO incident. It just couldn't have happened. So that explanation doesn't work. And I've heard other explanations from pretty prominent authors that this is not what we think it is, in terms of it being possibly a Russian experiment and so on. And I didn't find that evidence at all credible or compelling. Because this case has been around a while, and if you study it, you get to see the firsthand testimonies of a lot of witnesses, whether it's Frankie Rowe or Frank Dwyer or Jesse Marcel, who I was able to talk to firsthand, Jesse Marcel Jr., rather. So it's an amazing case. And I think it might be the one that eventually breaks this wide open, because we haven't heard the last of it. Somewhere out there is that craft. We've tracked it from the first people who saw it, from when it hit the ground, from the military personnel who guarded it, from the people who photographed it, from the people who picked up the wreckage, from the people who flew the wreckage, and the people who actually studied some of this wreckage. So that's how closely tracked this case has already been. It's an open conspiracy. You know, there's been no official acknowledgement of its veracity, but when Representative Stephen Schiff, that congressman, looked into it, he got stonewalled at every angle. It became very clear to him that this was a real phenomenon, and he said as much.
Have you looked really deeply into the fact that at that particular time in our U.S. history, the military was really liking the fact that they were playing scientists? I mean, they had scientists on the payroll from all over the world. They had some really interesting experiments, and they were really trying at that time to develop radar technology, and we're doing some pretty amazing things. Have you ever just tried to look at those things and pursue a different angle just to see what you came up with?
To a certain extent. I wouldn't say I follow up any theory and try to disprove or prove it. I more like gather the evidence and see where it sort of leads. But it became clear from studying all these early accounts from the 40s and 50s that our military was in a panic and over their heads and had no idea what they were dealing with. The estimate of the situation by Hillenkoetter, I forget how you pronounce his name, pretty much said these are interplanetary vehicles. That's what we think they are. They've known this from very early on. Despite what Project Blue Book ever said, despite all quote official government studies, which says there's really nothing to this phenomena, and there's no threat to national security, they knew from the beginning that there is something to this phenomena, and it is a threat to national security. They knew from the beginning that these things were hovering over atomic installations, military bases. They shut off our missiles at Malmstrom Air Force Base. And all this time they're telling the public, using our tax dollars, that there's nothing to this, and if you think you saw a UFO, you're lying, you're hoaxing, you're hallucinating, you're misperceiving, but you're not, didn't see what you think you saw. It's a travesty. It's very disingenuous, and I think probably illegal at some point to lie to people with that much gall.
But at the time, we had so many things going on, and we were engaged in war, and it was a really tough time in our history for people. So, do you think I have two questions here? Do you think that there was a cover up to kind of save the insanity of the nation? And in your opinion, how good was our military at thinking on their feet and reacting to a genuine UFO crash? What was their first reasonable thing they did to handle the situation that brought it to a point where they felt that they were possibly in control of the situation?
Right. I think, there's a lot of conflict here. Like the Roswell press release, that I thought was a good thing. And that's what you should have done. And things would have probably been a lot easier following that, because we would have brought our public into it. Yeah, it would have been a crazy time, but then we could have focused our attention and our resources and had a more truthful and transparent government. And instead, what it's led to is a massive cover-up, a real constitutional crisis. Honest to God, this is a serious situation. We know that all our intelligence services agencies are very interested in this subject. This is not speculation. It's been proven through the Freedom of Information Act. We've got the documents that show that NSA, the FBI, the CIA, the Air Force, the Navy, all of them are neck deep in this. They take it very seriously at very high levels. We've got enough government officials, generals and senators and representatives and governors and captains and people of very high rank who have gone on record publicly saying this is real. So we're at that point now where we're tipping towards disclosure. So I'm glad to see things are changing. But for years, this was not well handled, in my opinion.
It's such a difficult thing to cover up just about anything now, especially with all the information that we can exchange at light speed. But back then, what do you think was the most effective method that they used to cover up that event?
With Roswell, they threatened witnesses, and we certainly see that in other cases. So that was definitely one of their techniques. Apparently, they keep very close attention on landing trace cases. Timothy Good talks about some of these types of cases in his book, Above Top Secret, where a UFO would land on a road, leaving burn marks, and then they'd bulldoze it over the next day. This we've seen in a number of cases. So there are sort of things they do to cover this up. I remember when I was investigating cases in New York, I wrote a book about UFOs over New York. There was an incident. I don't have the exact details on it, but what I do remember is following the incident, the Air Force came in and released a bunch of balloons, which was a clear attempt to sort of muddy the waters. Probably what happened with the Phoenix Lights, because following the Phoenix Lights, the Air Force Base, Davis-Monthan, I think it was, released a bunch of flares south of Phoenix, probably to muddy the waters, and because so many people had seen and were reporting this giant triangular craft. So that's the sort of methods they use. And we know they have disinformation artists who go out there and just spread false information. Some people have come out and said, oh, yeah, I worked for the government and done this. So I came in this field so naive, thinking, wow, it's interesting, with little idea that there was greedy hoaxsters out there, disinformation artists, a massive cover-up, and that it's very pervasive, I think, within our society itself.
And I think, you're exactly right. And, one of my good friends, Rick Doty, loves that. I mean, he not only is a disinformation specialist, but he absolutely loves it, and he'll tell you so. Have you met anybody else like him in your life that you felt was a disinformation specialist that was so good at what they do that you would question almost anything that was coming out of their mouth?
Well, I don't want to name names, but there are definitely some researchers who are kind of on my naughty list because I just don't trust them.
Right. What
some
about
of the statements
that?
Yeah, I wonder about it. I wonder if some of these people, look at Stanton Friedman's research into Donald Menzel, who turned out to be one of these MJ-12 members. I think his research is outstanding in this, and it's clear that Menzel, who was a very vocal UFO critic, knew that UFOs were real. So this is what we're dealing with. And he was a well-respected author, astronomer, researcher. And I think we have ones that are, more contemporary today out there in the field right now, spreading stories that are pretty wild, honestly. So some of them, I'm like, I put them kind of on the back burner. I'm like, well, I don't have confirmation of this. I've talked to a lot of people who claim contact, people within the military, Navy. I've talked to a lot of people, and you sort of build a picture of what's going on. And when someone has a real outlier, I have to just sort of step back and be like, well, maybe it's true, but I have no confirmation of it.
But you believe the military would have no problem destroying someone personally who came forward, where if you were in the military and you came forward, were your days numbered? I'm not talking about being killed. I'm just talking about a career in the military or a career after the military.
Yeah. Well, I'm not exactly sure what you're asking me.
I mean, if you had a witness who was very credible, who was there, who saw some sort of UFO event, would the military have no problem doing whatever they could do to make sure that problem went away?
Well, yes and no. There are people who've gotten in trouble for going public. I talked to one guy, Ray Sachs. He was an electrician's mate on the USS Clamagore, which carried nuclear missiles, though that was not publicized at the time. This is back in the early 70s. And he was on board the submarine at service in the Atlantic, east side of the United States, off the coast there, when they had a USO, an unidentified submersible object, a UFO underwater, approach their submarine. Now, the submarine was on the surface at the time, and he was one of the lookouts. And this thing just came barreling up at about 100 knots, he said, very fast from the stern, and paces their submarine for like 15 minutes. And the captain was also up on deck. He saw it, as did the second person in charge and another lookout. And other officers started coming up on deck because they wanted to see it. And after 15 minutes, this thing finally darts off. There was no mention of it in the log. The second guy in command says, "How do you want me to write this down, sir?" And the captain said, "People who write this event down, or events like this, do not move up in rank." So it was covered up, at least to a certain extent. But the guy says, "Well, they never told me I couldn't talk." And I'm like, "Oh, okay, are you sure?" Because, I don't want to get you in trouble. Because often I'll talk to some of these guys, and like one guy was a Navy guy, Coast Guard captain, certified diver, the whole deal. And he's like, "No, you can't use my name. Please don't use my name. I only contacted you because there's no information out there about, USOs." And I'm like, yeah, I realize that. So there's not a whole lot of information about unidentified submersible objects. So that's how I've gotten to talk to some really interesting Navy guys. And some of them are nervous about going public, losing their jobs, and this sort of thing.
So do you have any examples of sightings or abductions or crashes that occurred in a civilian environment where the government interacted with civilians to threaten them, intimidate them, to shut them up? I'm not a UFO crash expert. I don't have any firsthand cases myself. I've certainly looked into it. I know it's not just Roswell. There's the Aztec UFO crash, the Paradise Valley crash in Arizona, the Kecksburg, Pennsylvania crash. I believe that had a lot of witnesses, and there were some threats made there. That's something we do see in these cases. I remember Bud Hopkins brought forth a case which just had one witness, and she was threatened. She was driving along a New Mexico highway, and her kid was actually an emergency response person and was brought to what she thought was a car accident, but it turned out not to be. It was an apparent UFO crash. She saw the bodies and everything. And government people came in, swooped up all the evidence, and threatened her not to talk. So
that is certainly a fairly consistent feature in UFO crash retrieval accounts.
One of the accounts that I think of a lot, and I've been looking at this lately and trying to absorb as much as I could find out what happened as I possibly could, is the sighting and abductions that happened in Berkshire County in Massachusetts, and that was in 1969, where, I mean, it's reported as many as 250 people either saw a UFO. There was people who reported being abducted. There was people who reported seeing aliens on the ground, two different large objects, different account, and at one time at least, and in many different locations. So here you have an event that happened over a large area, was seen and witnessed by a huge amount of people, and some of their stories are very compelling, and some of them are scary, in fact. And there was one case where a car full of people, they just found themselves, of course, some of them had missing time, some of them somehow were taken out of the vehicle and abducted. So what do you know about that case, and was there any widespread cover-up to prevent this sort of collateral damage that could potentially shake up the whole United States?
I don't know about this case, so I find it interesting. I'd like to hear more about it. It sounds like a real major event, but I can say that this sort of thing has been going on pretty constantly all across the United States and the world since at least the Roswell era. The Kenneth Arnold sighting was the one that kind of brought it all to the public consciousness. But it all came rolling in hard and fast in 1947, right along with the sort of atomic age. And since then, abductions weren't talked about in the beginning. It really kind of started out with the contactee era, with George Adamski and Howard Menger and a bunch of guys, Daniel Fry, Truman Bethram, all saying that they met friendly ETs, human-looking for the most part. And it wasn't until later that people started reporting abductions. And we've dated it earlier than the Betty and Barney Hill case in terms of when they've occurred. But that came out in the 1960s. And even within the UFO field, the idea of humanoids and people being taken on board was resisted. People did not want to look into that. And we saw the same sort of phenomenon with crash retrievals. That wasn't taken seriously for decades, even though Frank Scully put that out in one of the first books on UFOs, Behind the Flying Saucers. He mentioned the Aztec crash and the Paradise Valley crash and others. No one took them seriously, and the book was kind of debunked. Now people are taking a second look at it, and a lot of people think this, the UFO crashes he was talking about were legitimate. And it's pretty clear, if you look into this, that there are hundreds of UFO crash retrieval cases across the U.S. and the world.
You became interested in the 80s, and I really became, I guess, at a younger age in the 70s, interested in UFOs. But one of the things that it just seemed to me from the early to mid 70s till the time that you really got involved, there seemed to be a surge in sightings and alien abductions. Is that the case? I mean, in the mid to late 70s and early 80s, was there a surge in sightings and abduction cases and witnesses?
It seems like it. There was, of course, the Travis Walton case, the Pascagoula case. Might be because it was becoming more publicized. Jim and Coral Lorenzen, their book Abducted, came out shortly after the Betty and Barney Hill case. So we started getting a wave of publicity on these types of experiences, but it really didn't ramp up until Communion came out. It was sort of under the radar there for a while, but the 70s was very active in a lot of ways. And if you look you can pick any area on this planet and you'll see it's got a long, interesting, colorful history of UFO encounters. And I think we are seeing a phenomenon that is escalating. Certainly our awareness of it is escalating. I don't think it's going backwards in either direction. I think we're seeing closer and closer contact. So it's pretty much what I think we would do if we were to come to another planet. We'd just move in slowly, get them used to our presence, and eventually openly announce ourselves. Open official contact. And I think that's what we're moving towards.
One of the things you brought up, and one of the words that I heard you bring up a little while ago was Maelstrom, Great Falls, Montana, where I grew up just north of that. And I grew up amongst the missile silos. And one of the things that I think about when we consider UFO sightings is correlations and possibilities and maybe why that they would be there. And many people have come to the conclusion that, you know, places like that are ripe with military installations that have nuclear weapons. So do you see a correlation between nuclear weapons and UFOs?
I do. Yeah, I already mentioned the USS Clamagore carried nuclear torpedoes. Another guy I interviewed was on the USS Long Beach, Gary Wagner, and that's a nuclear-powered aircraft, ocean-going vessel. And they had a major UFO incident. So I think we're definitely seeing that in all types of areas of nuclear research. Los Alamos, that area's got a lot of atomic research going on in it, particularly in the late 1940s and 50s. And UFOs were clustered all over that base. And I think if you look, if there was a sighting over Palo Alto nuclear power station here in California. I know there's one over the station in Arizona, New York. Philip Imbrogno wrote about in his book about a sighting at Indian Point Nuclear Power Station, in which a bunch of people saw this. It was filmed. It came there a couple of times, hovering over one reactor, which turned out to have, quote, an irregularity in it. So that could be one of the reasons they're pointing this out, perhaps. But we do see, not just them hovering over, but actively intervening, like at Malmstrom and other places where they powered down the entire station. That's what happened at Indian Point. All the security went off and the power went completely off. So whether that's a display or what, it's some kind of communication.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had Robert Salas on, who worked out of Maelstrom and was based just east of there. And he had, of course, had the experience where their nuclear silos were powered down or something interrupted. And we discussed, what the protocol was when that happened and how they would bring that back up online. And it was a big deal back then. And, it would be scary, and I can see why the military would possibly try to keep that from us for reasons of national security. I think that the information that would be at hand with maybe the Russians or the Soviets rather at the time, knowing that there was some sort of weak gap in that system that could bring those missile silos down, would be interesting to them. Do you reckon that could be a reason that could be a national security risk?
For sure. Yeah, these things are flying around all over the place. And I think it's got a lot of countries on edge because we don't know where they're coming from. I've been told that at very high levels of government, our countries are cooperating. The major superpowers are cooperating on this subject to some extent. So I don't know if that's true. I don't have first-hand information on that.
Well, I think go ahead.
It's got to be causing all kinds of havoc at high levels, and we know that to be the case.
Well, I think too that this latest news that is on the front, the Galactic Federation, whereas technology is power. I mean, obviously that makes us sort of look like we have. If we're in some sort of federation with aliens, it makes us look like we're somehow a more powerful nation. I don't know if that means anything politically or if it's a lot of smoke, but it's interesting now that would come up. We had the recent release of the 3 videos by our aviators showing craft that were obviously unproven, but just a real strange situation. And so I think that that's part of our national security. Would also mean that we would try to look as strong and as knowledgeable as we possibly could, and that could be the case here. But I don't know. It's just a real wild situation when you have somebody as high up as this person once was in Israel, saying that we're part of a galactic federation, which involves stations on Mars and the U.S. and these aliens are part of that.
Right. Well, look at Paul Hellyer, former defense minister of Canada, and a lot of people. We have 2 presidents here who have seen UFOs, Carter and Reagan. Though Reagan never publicly admitted it, there's some very good information that he did see a UFO as governor. And
he alluded to the fact too, though, when he was president. I mean, basically made that one statement talking about aliens and didn't really go any further than that. But it's still interesting to note that he would use that, and obviously felt that it would be a possibility. Otherwise, it would be absurd to even bring that up in the first place.
Right. Yeah, like I was talking about earlier, all kinds of people at high levels. Governor Fife Symington says he saw it. Senator Russell of Virginia, I think it was, West Virginia, around there, said he saw a UFO. There was several representatives, people of all levels of government are coming forward. I think we probably do have a space force up there. That's logical. At some point we are going to have one. Whether it's active right now, I don't know. I don't have any first-hand information on that, but it wouldn't surprise me a bit, because we know how our government has a real tendency to lie about this subject in particular. Their track record is not good. And I think that's what's kind of forcing disclosure. This recent Pentagon disclosures with the pilots seeing UFOs, and that pretty good footage, though I have to say I've seen better, is definitely movement. And we haven't had any movement within official circles in terms of disclosure in a long time. So I'm pretty encouraged by that. And I'm encouraged to hear them saying, directly quoting, like, materials from otherworldly vehicles. We have those. That's a big statement. That should be front page news. Kind of slipped it in there this year, and kind of incidentally. So I think we're seeing some real interesting developments. And I'm not sure how it's all going to develop. I mean, it's very tightly controlled, I feel like. I'm not sure we're going to get the big disclosure moment that everyone's waiting for anytime soon. But who knows?
And you mentioned, too, that when you first became interested, you were talking to people and you started asking questions. And people that you had no idea were experiencers, related some story to you. And I think that that's true, that there are so many people that don't come forward. I think you take a look at, I get the email from MUFON and the number of sightings and reports. I just think there would be more. And the reason why is because, yes, I do talk to people, and they do find out what my interest is, and then they'll start kind of picking my brain, and I know they're getting to some point where they're going to tell me a story, So I kind of got to figure out a way to open it up a little bit so they feel comfortable talking about that. But I mean, you really literally can't be with a group of maybe even less 3 to 5 people where somebody else doesn't have a relevant story.
Right. Boy, it kind of blew me out of the water when I found this out. It was a real big adjustment because it wasn't taught in schools. And I think that's one of the things I always tell skeptics. Have you asked your family members? Have you asked people you trust, your friends, people you know? I think you'll be surprised because it's, according to J. Allen Hynek, he was quoted as saying 1 in 40 people have had an onboard UFO experience.
An onboard experience?
Yep.
Wow.
Taken on board. This is according to William Steinman. And I'm like, wow, that seems like a lot. I read this very early on. I'm like, there's just no way. That would mean I know someone who's been taken on board. And you know what? I sure do. I absolutely know people who have had face-to-face encounters with gray ETs and missing time and memories of being on board. So I'm like, okay. And then the Roper poll, which was, a polling service, came out some years later and said 1 in 50 people have the markers of being an abductee or an experiencer. So this is an epidemic, I think, or it's of epidemic proportions involving millions of people and possibly more than that. I know some people who are taken on board craft and they remember it fully consciously. And they see hundreds of people who are unconscious in like warehouse type rooms and things like this. And they think lots of people are being abducted.
Yeah. One of the things that I wonder about too, and I'm only thinking in terms of this because of my own experiences as a little kid, but I had some traumatic experiences as a kid and with sightings, whatever. I'm not going to get into that because it's a whole long story. But one of the things I noticed was the fact that, one night I was driving down the highway and it was really late at night. I was just a kid in high school coming home from a job. I worked at a radio station, closed that radio station late. No cars anywhere in sight. And this is in the middle of Montana, in the middle of nowhere. It's a 25-mile drive to this little tiny town that I grew up in, barely 100 people. When I see this huge green flash of light and to my left. And so eventually, long story short, I pull over and I look to my left and I can see against the background of, there was a little bit of light in the sky and mostly from moonlight, I could see objects like gray blotches in the horizon. And I saw them go up and I saw them go up and I saw the green light again as they went skyward as far as I could see. But just the interesting thing to me at that point was the fact that there was no emotion there. It didn't scare me. It didn't concern me. In fact, at that point in my life, it didn't even interest me that much. And I didn't tell anybody about it. And I was more interested in getting home to watch the little, TV I had in my room that we got 2 stations out there in the middle of nowhere. And, I jumped back in the car, which I've never told anybody, and just took off and burned rubber and got home. And that's the end of that story. But where I lived, there was a lot of people who saw a lot of stuff. And one of the things that was really common, and I lived out on the prairie, was dead cows. And, whether they're mutilated or not, I got to the point where I had seen so many, maybe 2-3 a year, because I spent lots of time outside, lots of time sleeping outside, lots of time looking up at the sky, that, I didn't even cause any concern or even faze me. It was just something that I think that people where I grew up in that northern Montana, Malmstrom Air Force Base, north of their area, between there and the Canadian border, I think that those people were used to seeing a lot of things and we didn't talk about it. So that's a really odd predicament there where, there's sightings and I talk to my friends and they've just really don't have much to say about it. And the one in particular who was a rancher and they had a lot of cattle mutilations or a few cattle mutilations, he just really doesn't have anything to say about it. So there's that. And I don't know what that is.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. And I think that's partly because there's been a lot of money and time and energy spent on making this phenomenon look ridiculous in society. So that there's an attitude of, ridicule if you talk about this. And it's been very effective. On the other hand, there seems to be coming from another angle where people will have an experience and sort of don't react the way you'd think they would react. They might even forget about it. There's an amnesia aspect to UFO encounters, not just abductions, but sightings as well. People can have a very dramatic sighting and just pass it off as nothing. And I think this is sometimes the ETs sort of saying, this is not the droid you're looking for, type of thing.
I think in my, I thought about that too, and was trying to figure out why, I would react that way or think that way or anybody else would. But then again, it's you really fight to examine that in a way that it's not going to be ET. It's going to be something else. So you think about that evidence and you think about other situations and you totally put off the reality of it and turn it into something it's not, because you don't want it to be that serious of an instance in your life where it would be traumatic. You would convince yourself that it was maybe I don't know, maybe it was an odd aircraft in the sky, one of our aircraft or whatever. But you really, really try hard to justify that it's not, because number one, we've heard that it's not okay to come out with that kind of information. And the other reason is, for national security purposes, but the other reason is that, crazy people see that stuff.
Yeah, it upsets your worldview. No, I've had some of my own encounters. It's interesting. I never saw a darn thing growing up. Never saw anything until I started researching this stuff. And I was out in the fields. I was seriously looking for UFOs, and eventually did have some pretty good sightings, which were not even when I was looking for them, really. One time I'm driving home. This was 1990. 2 or 3, I've narrowed it down to. It's got to be one of those years in late July. And I'd been visiting my brother, my sister-in-law in Woodland Hills. I lived in Canoga Park. I'd just moved there not too long ago. And it was late at night, 11 p.m. or so. And I'm heading down this little corner on this little tiny residential road. And this darn ball of light drops from the sky. And it's a tiny little thing. I thought it was a bird coming at me is what I thought, but it came swooping down real fast in this sort of parabola, I guess, an arc swooping downwards and stops right in front of my windshield. I'm going to say 1 foot in front, maybe 2 at the most, and it's about the size of a golf ball, maybe a ping pong ball, kind of that size, and soft white, obviously solid object, glowing, and it moves back and forth 2 times from end to end of my windshield. I'm staring at this thing just completely in shock. My car was stopped at this point. I stopped solid, and then it scoots forward, goes just slightly below my hood, and then curves upward and goes straight up. And I follow it up, it goes through the canopy and the trees, and it's gone, going straight up into outer space or something.
Wow.
This is where it gets weird. I should have turned around and said, "Oh my God, I just saw a UFO."
Right.
I honestly don't remember what happened at this point. I don't, because I've had other sightings, and that night I'm like lying in bed going over and over it in my mind. I'm like, wow, that was cool, and I better write this down. I didn't do that in this case. I didn't think about it. I forgot about it until a couple of months later, maybe a year. I'm not quite sure when it kind of popped back into my mind. But I sure remember it. I know this happened because I remember it. But there was this weird amnesia aspect involved to it, and I didn't react the way I thought I would.
No, and I think that's the case, and I don't know why that is, but again, I think with me it was just denial. The fact that I didn't really want it to be what it probably was. And, and I came up with a lot of excuses not to think about it. And I think I was just kind of waiting. I thought, well, maybe I'll stumble upon something, some sort of explanation. I'll hear somebody else that had, that sort of the sighting, and maybe they'll offer some sort of bit of new information that I didn't know about. And, it could be just as simple as, and then that's simpler than I could ever imagine. But yeah, I knew that I ignored a lot of that stuff as a kid, and I've told
it's easy to do.
It is.
Yeah, I was once with my sister-in-law and another person, and I'm talking to them, and this ball of light comes barreling through the room, kind of right towards us, and it catches my attention. I didn't want to say anything because I thought I must be seeing things. And I'm watching it go across, and my sister-in-law shouts out, "Oh my God, I see it too!" I'm like, "Whoa, you see that?" And we watched this thing move across the room. I would not have told anybody, honestly. I would have just thought, I'm seeing things. Because there's this weird tendency, like you say, to just kind of put it on a back shelf, and you're trying to figure it out, but at the same time, you don't want to look too deeply into it because it might upset the apple cart.
Right. And to if you do describe it to somebody else that hasn't had any type of experience like that, or doesn't believe or whatever, I mean, they give you that look, and that look is really uncomfortable. And it's sort of, if you have a friend who maybe is very skeptical and really doesn't spend much time outdoors and hasn't seen anything weird, it sort of affects that future of your friendship. You always have that kind of weirdness between you, even though it's not so weird, just because the reason it isn't weird is because so many people have experienced it. And again, they're just bottling that up and keeping it inside. So how long are you still a member of MUFON?
I am.
And
I've been a member.
You do investigations still?
Not actively for them. I did for a number of years early on, kind of moved off more independently. I'm still a supporter. I pay my monthly dues. I took the field investigator test, which was hard, by the way.
I heard it was hard.
Yeah, it was a take-home test. I took it before there were computers, really. So I had to study, and I'm thinking, well, take-home, this has got to be easy. But no, it wasn't that easy.
The reason I ask you about that is because, and it's just going back to what we're talking about right now, is when people have a sighting and you're assigned to do an investigation of that. I mean, knowing what you know, and because of your experience and your research and your writing, did you do a more comprehensive investigation than others would from MUFON, or do they keep those kind of on the same level?
I would say each investigator, dives into the deepness of, different levels. Some are probably more effective in certain areas than others. A medical expert, for example, I'm not.
Sure.
A medical expert, but I happen to know a couple of guys who are doctors. So, and I don't have connections within the military and this sort of thing. So I can't dive as deep as I'd like to in some of these investigations, but I do have my strengths, I think. I've learned how to interview people and sort of get additional witnesses. One of my biggest cases I thought was going to be a pretty simple case turned out to be an enormous wave of sightings, which was probably my biggest investigation. I ended up calling the police, coordinating with them, putting up flyers. I was knocking door to door. No kidding.
Wow.
I was sleeping out in the fields because there was this huge wave of sightings on one night, June 14th, 1992. And I wanted to get to the bottom of it. So that was one good example where I was able to dive deep and coordinate, on a wide level. But I've sort of shifted my focus to really interviewing people who have had firsthand encounters and getting this information out there, because there's a lot of excellent UFO researchers out there, but most of this research sort of stays with them, if you know what I mean. They're not publishing it. They're not putting it out. It's hard to get this information out to the public at large. And that's what I think is really important right now, is that people know, that this is going on, and there's an enormous amount of evidence in support of it. It's not speculation. We have mountains of evidence. UFOs are real, and we can prove it. We now have evidence within the public arena in terms of not only eyewitness testimony and landing trace cases, but physiological effects, injuries and healings. We've got metal fragments. We've got implant removal cases. We have all kinds of evidence to prove that this phenomena is real.
What's the number one place right now where people go and they can get consistent evidence and firsthand accounts? And it could be a magazine, it could be Facebook, it could be anywhere. But back in the day, you used to be able to buy magazines, and I remember as a kid I don't even remember what the magazine was, but used to see in Popular Science once in a while they'd have information or stories about UFOs, but. Where's the biggest clearinghouse of information right now that people that can go to or subscribe to?
There's so much out there right now, and it's pretty scary. There's so much out there because it's hard to. There's some disinformation for sure, and some of these websites, I would not trust them because they're often, this footage that's coming out, a lot of it is clearly fake. So you have to be very careful. I think one of the best places that people can go to would probably be the National UFO Reporting Center, NUFORC, and MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network. They both have great databases that are currently updated, and you can access them. For the most part, I think MUFON does have a paywall, but NUFORC doesn't. They're not perfect by any means. There are some really great researchers out there who I think are doing fantastic work, like RD Six Killer Clark. I love her books. They're kind of different than your run-of-the-mill UFO books out there. So, yeah, this is kind of a problem. As far as magazines and TV shows and things like this, it's very hard to pin down.
I'd love to see a really good UFO magazine again.
Yeah.
I love that.
There's some good ones out there. They're mostly online versions,
right?
But I like them. But TV shows, I'm like, I've been on TV a couple of times, and often it's always an interesting and fun experience. Don't get me wrong. But there's been a few times I'm like, hey, guys, once I had the news, want to track a story that I was doing. This was actually UFOs in Topanga Canyon during that wave of sightings. And I'm like, here's where the UFO landed. It was in this field. I've got reports of UFOs in that area, and there's a person who actually saw this land and blah, blah, blah. And I'm telling them the whole story. And the reporter points to a gopher hole, says, oh, is that one of the landing traces? And I'm like, well, no, that's a gopher hole. And he's like, oh, well, it looks like a landing trace, doesn't it? And I'm like, well, no. And he's like, well, could you mind saying it is one so we can use it? And I'm like, well, yeah, I kind of mind. He's like, and then he tried to trick me. He's like, would you just put your hand in there? And I'm like, no, I'm not putting my hand in there. Because I had learned, sometimes these TV people will trick you, and it doesn't come out quite like you would hope on TV.
Right. Let
me put it that way. So I don't trust a lot of these TV shows, and I see them. I've caught them doing wrong, and I'm like, shame on you.
I'm sure if they could dive in and be out there with you for like 6 months, instead of 6 hours, it'd probably look a lot different. But yeah, I see a lot of forced information too. And, unfortunately on YouTube and Facebook now, you see so many videos that, everybody's taking a video of every light, in the sky. And it's always been my opinion, if there's this vast technology that, that's taking something around the universe, why would they need light or whatever? And the other thing I always tell people is, when you're outside in the daytime, look around. It's the most important thing. If there's always people that have told me, oh man, I'd love to see one. Well, just look, and people are just too busy, and they're looking at their phone and whatever. And they're not sleeping outside, and they're not going for walks for 3 or 4 hours or hiking, or, and people go to places like national parks and hike around. They don't go just out in the middle of Nebraska and walk across a field for 3-4 hours looking at the sky. I mean, it's just something. It's a thing that people don't do, but when there are sightings, they seem to be pretty dramatic, and I think they're, in one sense, amping up because I've really heard some good stories in the last couple of years.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's funny. I was looking at all the cases I've investigated, and like, where were these people? And it was in suburbs, it was in cities, it was in rural areas, but almost all of them were outside.
Right.
A few of them were looking out the window, but mostly they were outside or perhaps driving. That's actually not uncommon. So definitely being outside is a big thing. And if you want to see one, you can. There's definitely techniques you can use to improve your chances of seeing a UFO.
Well, I always tell people go to north central Montana if you want to see a UFO. And I don't know what that's like now. I'm not amongst the nuclear arsenal anymore, but I'm further west in the mountains, and I have had 2 sightings, but not like when I was a kid when I would see, maybe one a year or something pretty spectacular once a year. And, so that was my question. Is it nuclear related? I just always felt that there was some kind of draw of that area or why they would frequent that area. There's got to be a reason, and it could be so. But I got one more question to ask you, and only because I'm interested in new things. So are there any UFO related stories that you know about that should be more popular or could be more popular, but really haven't taken off, like a Roswell story or a Berkshire, Massachusetts story?
Well, the Berkshire one sounds like one.
You're going to look into that one. That's a good one.
And yeah, there's new stories coming out all the time. I'm like, why isn't this more well known?
Right.
And there's some real sleeper books out there. There's one by Walter Webb, Incident at Buff Ledge. I'm like, wow, that was a damn good book. And I think nobody really even knows about it. It was just a very interesting firsthand onboard UFO experience story. And those are kind of my favorite kind. So perhaps I'm a little bit, discriminating that way. But that's kind of what I like to look for, is the firsthand information. There's lots of books out there that are kind of rehashes of already known cases. That's kind of why I like to put out new information and stories people have not heard before. There are, I'm sure, lots of stories out there which we haven't heard. I'm trying to think of a good one, but that's one that comes to mind.
Well, one of the things I was looking at earlier today is like on your website, you have a list of your books or actually a graphic of your books, but then you have excerpts of them too, and which is really cool. And I've never really seen anybody do that before. And so you're giving away a lot of information for absolutely free. If anybody wanted to have a really, really cool experience of reading about different UFOs and different stories and different books that you've put out. I mean, you put out a lot of information there for free, and somebody could spend 8 hours probably looking over that stuff. So talk about your website and where they find that.
Oh yeah, it's a real rabbit hole, I guess.
It is.
Because I do try to put out information. I know not everyone has the time to read the book, so I've got lots of excerpts there into a lot of different facets and avenues of UFO research, on USOs and the paranormal for that matter, because it is related to all this to a certain extent. I mean, I had to look into ghosts. I looked into levitation, out-of-body experiences, Bigfoot, the whole deal, because I do think it's related. And I also do have a YouTube channel because, some people don't even want to read. It's easier to just watch a video. And I'm putting out my stuff there as well, because I'm not in this for the money. I'm not in it for the fame. I'm really not. I'm in it because I was kind of devastated and scandalized when I found out this was real. It shocked me. And then to find out that it's being covered up was really upsetting. That this could be a very different world with, free energy and a clean environment and peace on earth. If we would just sort of wake up to the fact that we're not alone in this universe. I think people's behavior would change drastically. So that's kind of one of the reasons I'm in this field, trying to get this information out. And I do think we're going to be looking at a very different world coming up. I really do. As disclosure goes, forward, I think we're going to see more waves of sightings like Gulf Breeze and the Hudson Valley wave and the Topanga Canyon wave and Phoenix Lights and Stevensville and so on. We're going to have not only truth and transparency within government, or at least a growing sense of it, we're going to have open official contact at some point. It has to go that way if this is a real phenomena. You can't hide the truth. You can't hide the sun. You can't hide the moon. You can't hide truth. I think that's a quote from Buddha. And I like it because I think we're going to see definite changes in this field and how people perceive it.
So can you handle it?
I'm ready. I'm ready. I don't care what the ETs say. I think I can.
I can't. So no, I don't know. I'm that one is I'm up in the air. I mean, it's just I guess what I compare it to right now is COVID, because I mean we just were upended over a pretty serious virus, but there's many takes on that. I think it's serious, but we've really had a hard time with that, and there's a lot of people that probably suffered unnecessarily over it. I can't even tell you how many people I've met that are just so scared. They're so scared, and I'm not that scared. I'm just anticipating getting it and getting over it and being fine. But I just see so many people that are so scared. So it reminds me of ufology, and there are some people that are just really into it and they're up to it, and they're going to jump on board tomorrow. Right. But the
media is a bit fear-based.
It is,
because UFOs get a real bad rap in the media. They, and abductions and how scary and all this it can be, when in effect it's largely a neutral phenomena. I don't think it's overtly hostile. I really don't. Are they here to save us? I doubt it. And this is kind of what we're seeing with this whole fear-based culture. There's a lot of ignorance and greed and divisiveness and negativity, which it doesn't have to be that way. Love is the answer for humankind. That's a direct quote from a gray alien, by the way. Betty Andreasson,
right?
Her contact Quasga said that.
I love that story.
So I think that we're going to be fine ultimately. It's just we've got a rough road of learning how to come together and treat each other nicely.
One of the things that always concerned me was, the fact that I keep this podcast pretty secret. I mean, and I wanted it to jump out on its own merits, because I wanted it to be something that, it wasn't like I'm going to get my family involved and my friends and they're all going to listen. No, I wanted total strangers to start listening to it. So I kept it quiet from my family, and it was something that I'm very interested in. So I didn't really know how to approach some people at times to tell them, what this podcast was about. And one of those times was I teach a class about podcasting, a podcasting class at a college, adult continuing education. It's at night. So, here I come in, I set up, and these, 12 new people come in, and they limited the class size because of COVID, but we did it anyway. We went ahead with it anyway. And so I'm going to tell them, well, here's my website, and, because they want to know about website building, everything. So it's funny. So here I sort of bring this up, and here's my website. Here's this podcast I did last night. I talked to this guy, and super interesting guy. And obviously he's been abducted by aliens, and they're looking at this, and I playing him a clip, and the question was, what kind of microphone is that? So it wasn't like anybody had any great concern or any They weren't weirded out, at least, they were okay with it. And they didn't have really any questions about the content. It was more about the context and, how I did it, so I think there's a lot of people out there who probably are indifferent and aren't going to be affected by other people's stories and experiences. But there are those who are absolutely going to go bananas, and that's going to be interesting to see. But yeah, so Preston Dennett, your website is prestondennett.weebly.com. There's some other Dennetts in there that are mentioned. Who are they?
My sister-in-law, Christine Kisar Dennett.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, she's awesome.
Yeah, she's an amazing artist. She's done most of the covers for my books, illustrated a number of them, and still works as an artist for all kinds of experiencers and investigators. I come from an actually pretty large family. I'm fifth of 6 kids, so we're not. Yeah, they had a hard time with me getting involved in the subject. Some of them, for sure. Some were like, "Yeah, I saw one." So it was pretty interesting to see how the whole family reacted to it.
Well, they can get over it. So if you want to visit Preston's work or look for his books online, just go right to his website again, prestondennett.weebly.com. And sir, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a great pleasure. It's been a long time coming, and I've followed you for a long time, read your books, not all of them, but I'll get to them. And Preston Dennett, thank you very much.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. I had a blast.